Good morning, kitchen class. Hope everybody's staying in the air conditioning. It's been beastly hot this week. I also hope that everybody is keeping each other in their prayers and reaching out to one another as we're continue to be somewhat isolated. Well, last week we studied the first chapter of Daniel. Remember, the first six chapters of Daniel are six heroic tales set during the Babylonian exile of the Judahites. Daniel and his friends were teenagers, and among the 3,023 of the first wave of exiles from Jerusalem to Babylon. There'd be three waves, each wave growing much larger over a 20-year span. Last week, these four young men demonstrated their fidelity and commitment to God by refusing to consume unclean foods and wine from the king's own table. God responded to their faithfulness by gifting them with wisdom so superior to their peers that they were made government officials in the king's own palace. His conclusion was that they were 10 times wiser than his professional sages and wise men. At the beginning of that lesson, we took note of Babylon's strategy of assimilation of conquered tribes and nations. One way they did that was by asserting that Babylonian deities were superior to the deities of the conquered peoples. And secondly, the Babylonian king would choose attractive, intelligent young men to train in language and literature, law, and statecraft of the empire. This would be a life of ostentatious luxury and privilege. The chosen would be brainwashed, so to speak, to abandon their native culture and loyalties. And the chosen would be lifted up as examples to appease their fellow countrymen into accepting assimilation, a kind of propaganda. Becoming Babylonian meant turning their backs on the old values, beliefs, and religion of their country. One aspect of this was giving Babylonian names to these people. It was a sort of a psychological way of exerting authority over them. The four men that we studied last week and this week are Daniel, which in Hebrew means Yahweh is judge. He's given a Babylonian name, Belteshazzar, which means may the god Bel preserve his life. Hananiah means in Hebrew Yahweh is gracious. He's given the name Shadrach, which means command of Aku, who is the moon god. Mishael in Hebrew means who is what God is. And he's given the name Meshach, which means who is what Aku is. And Azariah means who Yahweh helps. And he's given the name Abednego, servant of the god Nego. You know, we see this same psychological kind of treatment in other settings as well. We probably all saw the miniseries Roots or read the book by Haley. And in it, Kunta Kinte, a Gambian, is enslaved, and he's given the English name Toby. And he resists answering to that name because it's a way of them imposing this enslaved status upon him, and he suffers the consequences. Well, after this first test, Daniel uses his God given gift of interpreting dreams. This is in the second chapter. He tells King Nebuchadnezzar what none of his other wise men can do, and that is what his dream is about a golden headed statue and what that dream means. Consequently, the king rewards all four and elevates them above all the other kings, all the other sages and statesmen of the king. And in response to this dream, the interpretation of it, which is that Babylon is the greatest of all the nations represented in the statue, Nebuchadnezzar becomes very prideful and full of himself, and he constructs a huge golden statue. He places it on a plain, Dura, some distance away from the city of Babylon, probably at the intersection of trade routes, and it's visible from a great distance. It would be like a booster rocket sitting out on Cape Canaveral. It's 90 feet high and probably on a pedestal, and 9 feet wide. And it's a symbol, excuse me, it's a symbol of Babylonian power, wealth, reach, and superiority. This is the setup in chapter 3 for our lesson today. This is a prideful creation of King Nebuchadnezzar. And we have these Jewish young men, the 4 Hebrew men, we see compromise when they can. They accommodate the demands of serving the king as long as they don't compromise their devotion to Yahweh. They faithfully do their job and advance the welfare of Babylon as long as it's within their identity as children of the God, of the Most High God. In short, they very wisely, diplomatically, quietly pick carefully where they must draw the line in the sand. As Jesus said when they tried to trick him, render unto Caesar those things which are Caesar's, and render unto God those things which are God's. Well, they drew such a line in the sand with regard to these unclean foods from the king's table in last week's lesson. And in the 6th chapter, Daniel will again draw that line in the sand when he refuses the command to stop praying to Yahweh. We all know what happens. He's thrown into the lion's den. And in this lesson, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego draw the line in the sand when they're ordered to bow down and worship this golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar has, has erected. Bowing down to the golden image, this idol, would have been a violation of the first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments. Idol worship, after all, was the reason that God had allowed the people of Israel to be conquered and taken off into exile. It would be a violation of the Shema that we find in Deuteronomy 6 that says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." Well, for this dedication of this edifice, the king collects a huge and august audience. All his satraps, governors, counselors, prefects. It's an illustrious throng of government officials to dedicate this statue. And if there's one thing we know about these ancient Babylonians, it's that they liked statues. Some of them still exist today. The most famous is the Lion of Babylon, which is an 8-ton block of basalt, black basalt, and the lion represents the god Ishtar. It was commissioned by this same king, Nebuchadnezzar. Well, we don't know where Daniel is. Daniel doesn't show up in our story today. He is made the chief administrator over the city of Babylon, so it's safe to assume that he is performing those duties while all these other government officials have gone out for this ceremony, but he's not in our lesson today. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were, and they surely knew that there was going to be a dedication of this statue, but it may well be that they did not know that worship was going to be part of the program. By the way, a little historical context. It's not biblical, but Greek accounts are that the same year that this statue was dedicated by Nebuchadnezzar is the same year that in Jerusalem, the Babylonian army finally levels the temple and takes the largest group of exiles from there to Babylon, all in the same year. Well, the king gathered this whole crowd, including our 3 young heroes, and they are ordered at the sound of a huge band of all kinds of instruments, some of which we don't even know what they are, but a cacophony of musical instruments. And when it plays, everyone is to bow down and worship the image, which is a representation of Nebuchadnezzar's sovereignty. To inspire compliance, at the other end of the plain is a great furnace, probably like a brick kiln, and it is fired up, and all who refuse to bow down to the statue will burn in that furnace. The first chord of music plays, all fall prostrate except for these three Hebrews. The Chaldeans, that's a ethnic subset of Babylonians, who are surely jealous and chafing at having been demoted below these four Hebrews, can't pass up the opportunity to tattletale, and they report the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to bow down to the statue. The king calls them before him. He really gives them a second chance, but he makes sure that they grasp the consequences. And he again orders them to bow down. And that is where our lesson really starts today. Nebuchadnezzar, in his effect, saying, "Obey me, or you'll burn in that furnace." And then he asks a question. The question is, who can deliver you out of my hands? Our text today, our story today, is going to answer that question. The three young men, in effect, say, we don't need time to think about it. And then we hear from them this amazing statement of obedience to God, and this statement of faith and trust in God. Before we proceed, I think this climactic statement of faith affords us a teaching moment. Babylon raised up these three to high official and high visibility for one purpose, and that was to show their watching countrymen that the benefits of turning away from Hebrew loyalties and to assimilation with Babylon, assimilation into Babylon culture and religion. God uses that very action, the raising up and raising the profile of these three, for a completely opposite purpose. He does it to demonstrate who the one true, all-powerful God is, and the difference between the power of man, even the greatest king on earth, and the infinite power of himself. Remember, we saw the same thing centuries later, when the Roman authority used a cross, a shameful way, a torturous way of death, and a sign on it mocking the King of the Jews, to crush the spirit of Jesus' followers. But God turned it on its ears. God emptied the tomb and turned the cross upside down. Today, crosses sit atop churches, and crucifixes hang around our neck as a firm affirmation of the power and love of God to defeat even death. We have experienced this in our own lives, where the very thing that evil intends something to be used for, God uses for a completely different purpose. Satan, the enemy of God, evil itself, may think that some debilitating disease like cancer will crush a Christian sister's faith in a loving God. Excuse me. But again and again, we, the watching world, see that faith, that trusting relationship in God, guide the Christian through the very valley of the shadow of death to a true joy in any and all circumstances of life. 1 Peter, the first chapter, 6-8 says, "So be truly glad. There's wonderful joy ahead. Even though you must endure many trials for a little while, these trials will show that your faith is genuine. It's being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is much more precious than gold. So when your faith remains strong through many trials, it will bring you much praise and glory and honor on the day when Jesus is revealed to the whole world. You love him even though you have never seen him. Though you do not see him, you trust him. And you rejoice in a glorious and inexpressible joy. In this very class, we have friends who suffer but their faith inspires our own faith. Well, back to our story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't know how this story is going to end. Yet they don't make any deal or condition with God. Either deliverance or martyrdom were equally possible in God's plan. But they know that God is over all. They surely remember the ancient story of Job, who lost everything, his family, his renown, wealth, health. Yet he was able, and we read it in the 19th chapter of Job, to make this affirmation of faith. For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. They must have also been of the same mind as their friend Daniel, who in the 2nd chapter prayed this prayer. Praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what lies in darkness, and light dwells in him. They were intimately linked to the living God, the creator of the universe. They didn't need to worry about what the crowd was doing or what the king was going to do. They didn't argue, bargain, or beg. They instead made this great profession of faith that we read in the 17th and 18th verses. It says, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your God or worship the image of gold you have set up. The teaching of these young men is that some things are more important than life. Jesus taught, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? In another place, Jesus teaches, if anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this sinful and adulterous generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. If you let me take a little sidetrack here on 2 points. In that last verse, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. That term is used by Jesus 80 times in the New Testament to refer to himself. The term comes from Daniel chapter 7. It's a messianic vision that Daniel receives that describes how the Ancient of Days, God, that's a reference to God, gives dominion over the earth to one like a man, the Son of Man, the Messiah, Christ, Jesus. Secondly, this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we sometimes think, what is these Old Testament stories, how are they relevant in our day and age? But this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was the basis of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s foundation and understanding of civil disobedience. He cited this biblical story, in his letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963. It's one, by the way, of the greatest American writings of American literature, theology, and political thought. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were saying, in effect, there's a higher power than you, Nebuchadnezzar, and we will not obey unjust or illegal laws. Martin Luther King Jr. said, neither will I. Earlier in our American history, we justified rebellion against the empire, the British Empire, by stating, as Thomas Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, laws that are higher and above those that man can create. Well, we all know how the story goes. There's no surprise. They get thrown into the fiery furnace. We learned this story when we were children. Uh, I heard my youngest grandchild tell me this story a couple of years ago. He said Shadrach, Meshach, and their big goat got thrown in the fire. Well, it also has been told in song. In 1969, the Man in Black, not David Henderson in our class, but the Man in Black, the real one, Johnny Cash, sang a song, and the refrain of it was this: they wouldn't bend. They held on to the will of God, so we're told. They wouldn't bow. They would not bow their knees to idols made of gold. They wouldn't burn. They were protected by the fourth man in the fire. They wouldn't bend. They wouldn't bow. They wouldn't burn. And the song ends, well, lo, I see four men unhurt, unbound, and walking down there. They're Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the fiery coals they trod. But the form of the fourth man that I see is like the Son of God. Nebuchadnezzar is an absolute tyrant, volatile and violent of temperament, and brutal and inhuman extreme. The 19th verse says, he was filled with rage, and his face was twisted beyond recognition. This may presage what we read in the 4th chapter, where he goes completely mad. He goes insane, and he roams about for 7 years eating grass like an animal. This is what happens to humans when they choose to reject fellowship with God. They become beastly, brutish, and base. Chapter 4 is written by Nebuchadnezzar himself, who tells how reason was restored to him by the grace of God. The pagan king is too proud to be transformed in the story we have today, but he is transformed, he says, as he writes in the 4th chapter. And he says, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. But right now, Nebuchadnezzar is defied, and he's not accustomed to being told no. It's also a matter of saving face in front of these palace leaders that he has gathered out here. So he's outraged. He's infuriated. As the saying goes, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Nebuchadnezzar is absolutely corrupt. And so he has the rebels brought before him. He has them bound. He heats the furnace 7 times hotter, and he orders his very strongest soldiers to take these 3 men and cast them into the fire. Notice the overkill here that highlights the pompousness and the irrationality of the king by contrast to the calm resolve of these 3 young Hebrews. Let's stop here for just a second, because there are 2 thoughts that come to mind that are worth contemplating in the week ahead. The first is that God could have stopped the story right here. He's already made up his mind that he's going to preserve the lives of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Sometimes God will save us from having to go through the fiery trials of life. But some other times he does not. Rather, he walks with us through the fire. It's a hard truth to be taught, but even with unwavering faith, there are sorrows and struggles that we have to walk through. However, when God goes through the crucible with us, miracles happen. When we go through the fire with faith in God and him with us, we come out unbound, unharmed, unshaken, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And secondly, this story and stories like it make me wonder, how would I fare if I had to stand firm in my faith in the face of those who are trying to harm, even kill me? I can't get that image out of my head of those Coptic Christians being beheaded by ISIS because they would not convert to Islam, or the teenage girl at Columbine School who is mocked for her belief in God as a deranged teenage boy murders her. I remember a true story from the communist USSR back in the Cold War days. Two soldiers burst in on an illegal Christian prayer meeting, guns leveled at them, and they say, "All Christians are under arrest and must come with us. If you're not a Christian, get out of here." And most of the crowd flees out into the night. After they go, one soldier slams the door and he says, "So are the rest of you Christians?" And the answer is yes. He says, "You've got one last chance to get out of here if you're not a Christian." Nobody leaves. So at that, they put their guns down and smile and say, "We're Christians too, but we had to make sure there were no spies here." I often wonder, how would I stand for my faith in those life and death situations? Well, back to our lesson today. The 22nd verse says, "Now the king's command had been rash, and the furnace was heated to such an extreme that the fire's flame killed the very men who carried Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to it. So these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound in the furnace of flaming fire." The guards' deaths highlight the lethal, the lethalness of the fire. The king is ruthless, unstable, enraged, infuriated, but then suddenly we read he's shocked. He can't believe his eyes. He says in the 25th verse, "Look, I see four men unbound, walking around inside the fire, and they are not hurt." In the Catholic Bible right here are included two hymns. They're omitted from most Protestant Bibles because they are only found in later Jewish translations, Greek translations, about 100 BC. But they are still beautiful songs of joy to God. And the second is called the Song of the Three Young Men. And it tells how the angel created a whirlwind of moist whistling wind that they walked within to protect them from the flames. Some believe the fourth man was an angel, others that it was a manifestation of God himself, perhaps Christ. But we're not told. We don't know for sure. But what we do know is that God sent help to these three men. Our heroes were not alone in the furnace. Also, in our earthly crucibles, we're not alone. God's Spirit is with us and in us. John says in 1 John, the 4th verse, "Greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world." It's a miracle. No one could explain it any other way. God was powerfully and unmistakably present in these events. As Deuteronomy 31 assured Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's ancestors, it says, "The Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." When they first arrived in Babylon, they asked the question, "How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" The psalmist said, "Sing a new song." And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do. They sing in the fiery furnace. And also, we have songs that we sing at times like this, like that great old hymn, "I know not why God's wondrous grace to me he hath made known, nor why, unworthy, Christ in love redeemed me for his own. I know not how this saving faith to me he did impart, nor how believing in his word wrought peace within my heart." The 4th verse says, "I know not what, of good or ill, may be reserved for me, of weary ways or golden days before his face I see. But I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day." Emma likes to sing that modern song, "God's not dead, he's surely alive. He's living on the inside, roaring like a lion." The 26th verse of our lesson text tells us that the king went near the opening of the furnace, and he said, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. You know, the king could change their names. He could alter their earthly status. But with all his power, he could not wrest their identity from them. And he acknowledged it. They were servants of the Most High God. No thing and no one could take that from them. The 27th verse says, the king and his associates examined them, said the fire had done nothing to them. Their hair wasn't even singed. Their garments looked the same as when they were thrown in. And they didn't even smell like fire, which is pretty amazing. The only change, what was the only change? They were no longer bound. What's the teaching in that? The teaching is when Jesus walks with us, the only thing we lose in the fire are the bonds, the chains of sin that enslave us. I like the modern arrangement of Amazing Grace that says, the Lord has promised good to me. My word, his word, my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. My chains are gone. I've been set free. My God, my Savior, has ransomed me. And like a flood, his mercy reigns. Unending love, amazing grace. But God does change us in trials and tribulations. He transforms us. Before they left Jerusalem, the prophet Zechariah said that the Lord will refine them like silver and test them like gold. God speaks through that great old hymn, How Firm a Foundation. Its 4th verse says, when through fiery trials thy pathway still lie, my grace, all sufficient, shall be thy supply. The flame shall not hurt thee. I only desire the dross to consume and thy gold to refine. It ends, that soul, though all hell should endeavor to shake, I'll never, no never, no never forsake. There are so many aspects of this story to meditate on and to learn from. Some of them you're probably thinking of now that don't come to my mind, but I would like to mention 2 or 3 that come to my mind for you to think about perhaps this week. There's a theology known as God the Observer, and it suggests that after creating earth, God simply sat back and waited to see what would happen. It acknowledges God as creator, but nothing more. It's like a master watchmaker who creates a watch, winds it up, and then sets it aside to listen to it tick. These verses belie that. These verses, we see God as an active, invested, a powerful participant in the human story. And that's a comfort to us. Creation was not a one-time thing with God. It's an ongoing thing. Every birth of a child, every bloom of a flower, every saving act is God's hand powerfully working in the world. A second thing to think about is that Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego did not argue with the king. They didn't try to change his mind. They didn't evangelize. They didn't quote scripture. They didn't preach. And there are times when we have to realize that the most powerful witness to our faith is when people observe how God works through us and through our lives, whether in little disappointments or great tragedies. You know the saying, you may be the only Bible someone ever reads. Even Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king of the civilized world, acknowledged God's power in reality and allowed the Hebrew people to worship their own God. He harshly commanded that no one was to speak ill of Yahweh and that the God of the Hebrew people would be respected. Why that great change in Nebuchadnezzar? Well, because he saw firsthand God working through these three Hebrew teenagers. The third thing that I think we can think about is mentioned by the author of the adult study student book that you have. She says, God's message of deliverance is clear for all to see. There's no doubt in the minds of these palace leaders that something miraculous and awe-inspiring had taken place, that God and God alone had done for these three Hebrew men, and it had left a lasting and life-changing mark on them all. You know, we see the evidence of God every day. Sometimes we see God in ordinary wonders. Sometimes we see him in the grandeur of nature. But sometimes God is unmistakable and inescapably visible in miracles like is in this story today, that just can't be explained as anything other than as the work of God's hand. One of the lessons here is never minimize the miracles. Never pass them off as just luck or happenstance or coincidence. When we're open to the work of God in the world, all God's miracles, great and small, become detectable every day all around us. Those things that Sandy likes to call God things. We're poorer for it if we miss them. And then one last thing to think about, I think, is that our lesson started with a golden image. Nebuchadnezzar was doing God's enemy's work in erecting it. The strategy of the enemy is always, and at all cost, to get us to look away from God and to some golden image. That idol may be our circumstances, our aspirations, our desires, our prideful egotism, even things that in and of themselves may not be bad, but they're given the wrong priority with regard to and relative to God. Also, the strategy of the enemy is to ensnare in the sound that creates an atmosphere of confusion around us. In this story we have, there's a sudden blaring of all these musical instruments, and it's confusing, and they bow down. You know, the first time we see Babylon mentioned, it's in the guise of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. In there, the Hebrew word for confused in verse 9 is Babel, which sounds like Babylon. That noise is confusing, and we can't find our way. Today, there is so much noise in the world. It's hard to think straight. Sometimes it's loud and blaring on the news, and sometimes it's that persistent ping on our electronic devices that seems to come while we're trying to pray. And we have to make the choice to shut out that noise and to think like God thinks. Well, the purpose of this lesson, is stated in the student book, is to help God's people endure in faith despite the consequences. This story reminds us to keep our eye on God. Joan of Arc, her last words are supposed to be as she's being burned at the stake: hold the cross high so I can see it through the flames. In her end, she wanted to keep her eye on God. The praise song says, I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. These three Jewish heroes of the faith kept their eye on God, and they did not turn back. We follow Jesus, the one who went all the way to the cross. And I think a good way for us to end this lesson today is to be reminded of the prayer he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, mindful of the challenge for us to pray it also. He said, Father, if it is your will, take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not my will, but your will must be done. God bless you and have a wonderful Sabbath day. Amen.